In recognition that there are people from lots of different countries, I think I've isolated some of them. So, labvakar to those of you in Latvia, gukvel erev tov, hyvää iltaa, bonsoir, guten abend, and dobry večer to those of you in Prague. So, my name's Tim, I'm an addict. I'm also an alcoholic and awful in lots of important ways. And here I am back again, 32 years clean. Now, what we're going to discuss today, the topic is leaving aside the drink question. What we've covered in the last few sessions is the basics of step 1 and the basics of step 2. And what we've concluded so far is that, well, when I use, I could be off for years, so I must never use. However, I will use, and I can't stop me from using, and you can't stop me from using, but God can stop me from using. How do we know? Because God has stopped everyone else who has sought him from using, provided that certain rules are met. Now, the book's very clever. It hasn't really looked at the rest of our lives at all. It's just looked at alcohol. Now, this is CA, so we substitute the word drugs and then we're just as far ahead. If you have process addictions, then you substitute whatever it is. A very simple way of looking at addiction, as I've said in other weeks, but it's worth repeating, is that an addiction is a persistent return to a destructive pattern, a persistent return to a destructive pattern. Which means that whatever the problem is, you can substitute that problem in. Now, the reason we're not going straight into step 3 is because step 1 really has nothing to do with anything but the straight addiction. It's not interested in the rest of our individual lives, but there are things going on. And so the first section, I'm just going to be copying things into the chat. The first section is this: what is wrong with us apart from the mental obsession? And the first idea is this, and this is going to be a little bit surprising. As I've said in other weeks, I'm interested in what the book says, not what the fellowship says. If you want to hear what the fellowship says, well, you already know. You've been to 1,000 meetings. You know what people say. I love the fellowship, but I adore the book, and the book is where I got my progress from. I needed the fellowship as the vessel to hold me, but I get my information from the book. And if someone in a meeting says something that's useful, if it's consistent with the book, marvellous. Now, there's an idea in the fellowship, and they may be right. I might be wrong here, so just be careful. It could be that other people are right and I'm wrong. People sometimes say that alcoholics are somehow fundamentally different than normal people, that we're broken in special ways and we've got some sort of different spiritual yearnings that ordinary people don't have. The book is not so sure about that. That doesn't come from the book, that comes from somewhere else. What the book says is something rather surprising. We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. What, you mean there's no such thing as alcoholic thinking? There isn't an alcoholic personality? Well, the book doesn't seem to think so. Now, there are other things going on, and a couple of those, some of those have got to do with drinking. Let's look at the first one of those. So the first one of those is with drink and substances and other things I did very much damage the way I don't know much about the brain, but the way my mind worked became bizarre and wrong in all sorts of ways. My perception of everything became warped, and the book recognises this. It's not saying we had some kind of peculiar alcoholic personality. You know, people say I was an alcoholic from the moment I was born. That idea is not in the book. But what it does say, for instance, it is usually because he is warped and sickened that he says and does these appalling things. And in another passage, interesting, when they use the word twice, pay attention to it. Many alcoholics, being warped and drugged, do not wish to quit. It's talking about the effect of alcohol on the mind. The substance will do this to a person. It's not that one isn't warped because one's coming to alcohol with a completely different brain. One comes to it with a brain much like anyone else's. A few years of using, and the brain's going to look different. I went to an event in Germany, a number of years ago in Frankfurt, where they had a very prominent German doctor talking about how the brain scans of alcoholics who've been using for years look very different than normal people. But he says if you take the alcohol out of them and give it a few years, the brain scans start to look normal again. So this is the first problem. What's the solution? Well, the book is splendid. It never gives you a problem without a solution. It's rather like nettles and dock leaves. The solution is there if you're looking for it, and the solution is detox. We favour hospitalisation for the alcoholic who is very jittery or befogged. And I've known people that I detoxed in the community, as they say. I've known people that had to go away for 3 months to get the rubbish out of their system because the physical craving continued to have an effect for weeks and months, particularly the case with benzos and other opiates as well. It takes a long time to let go. People report to me on a regular basis. Now, there's another problem which is particular to alcoholics, but again, it flows directly from the effect of being drunk most of the day or hungover the rest of the day and running around and doing awful things when one is drunk or high. And the line that tells me this, there are lots of lines, but one in particular from the doctor's opinion. It says, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. And again, the book provides a solution to that. 1, 2, 3. But the head of the house has spent years in pulling down the structures of business, romance, friendship, health. These things are now ruined or damaged. So that's because of the alcoholism, that's because of the addiction. It's not a separate problem. It says it will take time to clear away the wreck. Though old buildings will eventually be replaced by finer ones, the new structures will take years to complete. So this is simply the ordinary basic common sense of sorting out all of the practical things, mending relationships, acquiring a skill, getting a job, learning how to behave like a regular person again. But all of this is to do with the addiction, the use of the substances, not even the addiction, the use of substances, the separation from normal society for a number of years. Now, there is another category as well, and I fell into those first two categories of problems. So this is beyond the mental obsession. Problem 1 is the mind being warped, the brain being warped. Problem 2 is all of the practical problems which have accumulated. The third one is this little phrase that we use, problems other than alcohol. And here we have in the doctor's opinion this indication that there are all sorts of things wrong with some alcoholics, but not others. There are, of course, this is from the doctor's opinion, there are, of course, the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable. There is the type, you don't need to raise hands. If you identify with one of these, just you feel free to keep it to yourself. So, psychopaths emotionally unstable. I think those are actually two different categories. I think they use the word psychopath now differently. It denotes something different than it did then. Essentially, I think he's using it as a generic term for mental illness rather than the true psychopath. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. There is the manic depressive type. Then there are types entirely normal in every respect except in the effect alcohol had upon them. They are often able, intelligent, friendly people. Now, because I came in with lots of other things, I was very confused for a while. I thought that all of these other things that I was suffering from were features of my alcoholism, and they weren't. They were going to kill me. But as I've said before, I can look around my family and the poor souls. A lot of people are very unwell. Some people are great. Some people have become well. But there are a lot of people with serious problems, particularly on my mother's side. God bless her and her extended family. That's not alcoholism. But there is an extraordinary thing here. And this is why, in part, I got confused. I'll tell you why I got confused in a moment. I'll read the passages first. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. I said to my sponsor in my first year, in my step 5, I'd heard people at meetings talking about sharing during their step 5 all of their character assets. And I said, Doug, do I have any character assets? He said, yes. I said excitedly, what? He said, a willingness to change. And then he stopped talking. Nothing else was mentioned. But I had the ability to be honest. I had such an ability to be honest. Groups had group consciences to work out how to shut me down because I was being a little bit too honest. I would share for 20 minutes about despicable things that despicable people did to me during my childhood. I would hold court. I would hold groups hostage. I was basically the West London training programme on how to run group consciences, because wherever I went within a couple of weeks, they were holding a group conscience to work out how to handle me. There was stuff going on, but I had the capacity to be honest. And there's another wonderful line on 114. For years, we've been working with alcoholics committed to institutions. Since this book was first published, AA has released thousands of alcoholics from asylums and hospitals of every kind. The majority have never returned. The power of God goes deep. Now, my experience with all of that other stuff, I did see various professionals. It's very difficult to demonstrate effectiveness of this or that. But my big breakthroughs in recovery came from telling the truth in step 5, forgiving people in step 4, going and finding everyone that I needed to find in step 9, even tiny little things, borderline things, small things, little thefts, returning every single physical item in my possession that I had taken or borrowed and never returned. Every single thing I could think of. When I did that, when I started to sponsor people who asked me, when I really started to go down the spiritual path in step 11, that's when all of the other problems that I had, that's when the great breakthroughs happened. Lots of it was just the common sense of AA. Now, just because the AA fellowship and the things I learn in meetings and the things it says in the book and all of these wonderful things, just because they work to relieve those other problems doesn't mean that those other problems are alcoholism. So AA is very like, you see, it's not AA which is solving my problems, it's God who is solving my problems. So God is like that substance WD-40. I've never purchased it or used it. I understand it's one of those chemicals you can use for 1,000 different things. It's a bit like, you know, if you go, I'm going to say something frightfully sexist here, so you're going to have to hunt me down if I say this wrong. But I've known women, you go into the bathroom, there are thousands of different products, one for every specific purpose. Women, I don't know if you've ever been into a men's bathroom, we have one bottle and it does shampoo, conditioner, face wash, body wash. It claims to be a moisturiser. You're supposed to be able to shave with it. You can descale your Nespresso machine with it. You can literally do anything with it. And the program's a bit like that, because it leads to God, and God's like, since we're here, since we're dealing with this person, we might as well clear up everything else as well. You know, when you get someone in to decorate a room and they fix a lot of other things as well because they don't want to be thought of as doing a bad job, so they just fix everything. And that's what the program did for me, not because the AA program did, although it did in a sense. It's because the program led me to God, and God seems to have solved those other things. It doesn't mean those other things are alcoholism. It's just like with going to the doctors with a particularly bad bacterial infection, and you're given a particular antibiotic which will kill a dozen other things you have wrong with you at the same time. And that's what I think the program is like. And then there's a tremendous thing as well, the question of human problems and how the program solves that. So it became very fashionable from the early 90s onwards. I don't think you hear it much before that. It was a couple of speakers whose innocence I'll preserve, who I think popularised this to classify the so-called bedevilments on page 52 as the mysterious hidden third element of alcoholism, being the spiritual malady. Now, I think it is a spirit. They are features of the spiritual malady. But let's see what the book says first. It says, our human problems. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Now, I think some of these very clearly relate to drinking alcohol for a decade or three. But others, so the inability to make a living, you can see how that's going to stem from alcoholism, trouble with personal relationships, perhaps the others as well. But it doesn't call these either generally alcoholic problems or even or certainly not exclusively alcoholic problems. It says human problems. And all the way through the book, there are examples, I'll come to some later, where we discover that this spiritual malady is not a peculiar thing that we have, to which alcohol was a solution. It's a human condition, essentially. Now, the solution to this, when we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. So this relationship with God business, I adopted it as it were a sledgehammer to crack a nut of the mental obsession in relation to alcoholism. But it was such a good solution. It solved two other problems as well. It solved all of the other really very grave mental disorders I came into recovery with, and the solution seemed to solve all of my general human problems. How to handle life. Sometimes people say I wasn't given the rule book for life. Other people seem to have it. Seemed to have it. That's the key word. They didn't have it any more than we did. There isn't a book. No one was told. The ones that were told didn't listen. The number of situations you come across where people do absolutely everything right, as parents. I mean, of course they make mistakes, but none of the horror stories, and they're considerate, they're supportive, they do all of those things, and still the kids are in therapy at the age of 32 blaming everything on the parents. It's just going to happen, even when the parents get it right. So this is universal. I've kept up with a lot of people from 30, 40 years ago, and I mean, this is a terribly unfair and unscientific thing to say, but my general observation is the people who've got a relationship with God, even a strange or tenuous relationship with God, seem to be okay. They seem to do better. I'm seeing other people one by one unraveling. It's taking a long time. But I think what we're dealing with seems to be universal. So the human problems, so we've covered the first three categories. Just to sum up, so the first three categories of the mind warped by drugs, detox, sobriety, and good food, sleep, exercise, and staying away from certain behaviours, that will, in my experience, help the mind heal. Some diligence, hard work, common sense will sort out the practical stuff. Give it 5 or 10 years. Just give it a minute before you judge whether that's going to sort itself out. It takes a while. Similarly, the mental illness stuff, it took a while. My last panic attack, I think I was 14, 15 years sober. So it takes a while for things to go away completely, in my case. The human problems, the spiritual malady started to be solved very quickly with the attack of the program. Now, these human problems, where do they come from? Why do we even have them? Now, the book is very ambitious because it dares to tell us. The three quotations, which I think are appropriate here, and I've labelled this the first sin of pride. The eagle-eyed among you, and those with religious training, will say, why didn't he say original sin? It's because I didn't want to say anything specifically religious, but the idea is not unconnected. So Bill on page 49 writes, instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, you see, that's how he's implying we should be. Intelligent agents, not dumb people who don't know a damn thing and just need to ask a sponsor what to do. We're intelligent agents. We still might need to ask a sponsor to do sometimes, but this isn't a Ponzi scheme. Spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation. God's in charge. We're here to do a job. The line is brilliant. Already it's told us what the solution is before it's told us what the problem is. The problem. We agnostics, denying God, atheists sitting on the fence, chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, the beginning and end of all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? Now, this beginning and end of all is wonderful because it points me to what the problem is. When I am the beginning and the end of my life, when I think I created myself and I live for myself as the purpose of my life, I am in trouble. This is the self-concern, a life based on self. And 62, there's a lot more, but 62 sums this up beautifully. Whatever our protestations, that's our objections, are not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, or our self-pity. Someone said, have you ever thought that when a giraffe drinks a cup of coffee. By the time the coffee reaches its stomach, it's cold. Of course you haven't. You only ever think of yourself. Perfect. It's got you. Now, these allusions to me being the beginning and the end, my intelligence, my intelligence, he's not talking about the faculty of intelligence. He's talking about one's perceptions, one's interpretations, one's thinking, one's plans, one's designs. Reminded me of something. I'm going to quote something from an outside source. If it helps, use it. If it doesn't, ignore it. But there's this brilliant definition of pride. Now, pride is used in the 12 and 12. So Bill had come under the influence of Father Ed Dowling, who was a slightly grumpy Jesuit from, I think, St. Louis. Anyway, somewhere, not New York. And he would talk to Bill, and Bill picked up a lot from him and from other religious people over the years. So he talks about the 7 deadly sins. And the first of those is pride. And there's a book called the St. Augustine Prayer Book, which is interesting. And in there's a list of all human character defects, which is there so that one can do an inventory if one wants to do an inventory. So I think it's the Episcopalian Church has its own inventory system. We're not the only people to do inventory. In there, it describes pride thus. Pride is putting self in the place of God as the centre and objective of our life, or of some department thereof. It is the refusal to recognise our status as creatures dependent on God for our existence, and placed by him in a specific relationship to the rest of his creation. Now, to put that very simply, I should be a servant of God, but I'm working for myself, to my own ends. That is the source of the problem. And that's not peculiarly alcoholic. Alcohol and drugs and other things distracted me for a while. But that was the pre-existing thing. But that pre-existing thing, you look at the world and you'll find the occasional example of people being concerned with themselves and a tiny little bit self-righteous about others. You have to look hard, but you'll find it. It's there. Now, that's where it starts. But then self, that's the seed, the plant of self, the horrid, monstrous triffid of self. If you don't know what triffids are, go and look them up. English people who are 50 or British people who are in their 50s will remember the day of the triffids. No one else will know. Now, this is the mechanics of self. I'm going to read a passage, a few passages in fact, and then tell you why those passages make sense to me. But when you get to step 3 in the book, it doesn't just say, right, you need God to avoid drinking, so what should we do? Let's just turn our wills and lives over to God. It says, no, steady on. Let's wait a minute. Let's just look at the whole question of you in charge versus God in charge. Because if you're going to be handing your will and life over to God, if you have any resistance to that, it's not going to work. So let's get rid of your resistance by looking at the nifty job you've been doing of living up to now. So the first requirement of step 3 is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Self-will is when I work out what I want and then I do it. Very simple. On that basis, we're almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. Because other people have plans too. The laws of nature have plans. They've got systems, and one can't buck those systems. God arguably has plans. So if I'm going to go into the system with plans, I'm going to be in collision with God, with others, with the laws of nature, And also, I'm not going to talk about chaos too much, but there's some chaos involved as well. Even though our motives are good, grammatical point, when Bill all the way through the big book says even though, he means even if. So it's not presupposing that our motives are good, even if our motives are good. Now it makes sense. Our motives might be good or they might not, even if our motives are good. Most people try to live by self-propulsion. Most people, not most alcoholics, most people, by self-propulsion. I work out what I want and then I go and try and get it. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show, is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. Brilliant idea, because when you're the actor, there are two people involved. There's the actor and then there's the part that they're playing. All of the roles in the world are not who I am. I am the actor who is playing those roles. When I'm in a materialistic mindset, I forget that I'm actually an actor put here by God. I become those roles. Have you ever been criticized at work and you feel that you are under threat? Or your partner or your wife or your spouse criticizes you or looks at someone and you feel under threat. Whenever I feel under threat, it's because I have identified with one of the roles that I have. I'm the actor playing Macduff who has forgotten he is the actor, and seeing that people in Macbeth, in the play of Macbeth, are falling like ninepins around him, and he wonders if he's going to be next. Macduff should be frightened. The actor has nothing to be frightened of unless he forgets he's the actor and becomes the role. But this is not all. I think I'm the director. I think I know how all of this should be. So, if his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Not just what I am getting out of it, the whole world will be better. Everyone, including himself, would would be pleased. And if you go onto social media, full of people convinced that if other people did what they said, the world would be a better place. If you've only got one person with an idea of how things should be, the plan has a chance. As soon as you have two or more, everyone's in trouble. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, our actor may sometimes be quite virtuous. He may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest and self-sacrificing. On the other hand, he may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest, but as with most humans, he is more likely to have varied traits. Now, this problem of living life run on self is wrong in two ways. Firstly, it's immoral in its structure, because it's going against other people's will, it's going against God. And secondarily, you might be deploying character defects to try and get your own way, but you might be employing virtues to try to get your own way. One of the characters, Fred, says his old life was by no means a bad one. Often the people I see who are thoroughly selfish but successful are successful because they're using virtues to get their own way. But the problem is the whole system is doomed to failure. The house always wins. And here's the problem. Still, the play does not suit him. How many times have I said, when I get to this point, I'll be fine. When I get to secondary school, when I get my A-levels, when I get to university, when I leave university, and the list goes on. People my age, because I'm 1,000 years old, people my age are saying when I retire next year, it'll all be wonderful. You retire. What's next after that? Well, you don't want to think about that too much. Now, Why does it fail? Well, it fails for lots of reasons, but one of them is the next quotation: our little plans and designs. The system fails because, as G.K. Chesterton says, the material cosmos is too small for one real human life to fit inside. Being humans means that the material won't satisfy us. The dog is satisfied, the human being won't be, because there's more than just what is here. So trying to get from what is here the thing to satisfy us won't work. And to sum this up, basically the problem is living life with objectives based on self, thinking that this is the way everyone should live, trying to control others but they've got plans too, and deploying all of my virtues, all of my devices to this end. The result of that, I'm in conflict with others. I'm in conflict internally within myself. The person that wants a kick wants the cake. The person that wants to be thin is furious at the bit of me that wants the cake. And you find those conflicts endlessly. Each different character within one is fighting against all of the other ones because they each have different objectives. The plan fails in lots of different ways. This leads to frustration and resentment. When the plan succeeds, it leads to dissatisfaction and despair. I worked for 3 years to get a qualification, and I got it, and I was thrilled for a week, and a week later I was depressed because it hadn't done the trick. It hadn't done what it was meant to do. Little Red Riding Hood in Into the Woods says something about red capes. They do not protect you as they should. It's a brilliant line. The thing that is promised is not delivered. And the little plans and designs are little compared to what will really satisfy. And these ideas are reflected in fairy tales, in myths. These are not new ideas. The Princess and the Pea, even when she's sleeping on 1,000 mattresses, she can still feel the pea under the bottom mattress. But the problem is not the solution to the pea is not more mattresses. The solution to my internal problem is not different things in the world. It's not a rearrangement of my life. People say to me, if you're unhappy, don't change anything externally. Change yourself internally until you're happy with things as they are. Then you're allowed to change. But never change anything externally. Unless something is bleeding or on fire. There are a couple of situations you might want to attend to. But in general, don't change anything externally thinking it's going to change something internally. The futility of this. There were these characters, 50 of them, the Danaides in Greek mythology, who were condemned to carrying water for eternity in sieves. Now, if you've ever tried to carry water in a sieve, you'll realise it won't work. If you're not a native English speaker, a sieve, a basket with holes in the bottom. The myth of Sisyphus, the Greek character who was condemned for eternity to push a stone up a hill and then see it roll down and have to push the stone up the hill the next day. And George Carlin, I think, put it best, if I can rank him with these mythological characters. He said materialism is like trying to satisfy hunger by scotch taping sandwiches to your legs. Now, this is where the ego gets remarkably clever, because the ego is doing rather well out of this, because it is our chief advisor in all of our activities in the absence of God. If you've seen King Theoden in the Lord of the Rings films, the character Wormtongue, who is whispering into his ear, and Wormtongue is a henchman of Saruman the White, who has become evil at this point. if you haven't seen the film, if you haven't read the book, we'll go and do that maybe between now and next week. But if you've seen it, Wormtongue and Theoden. Wormtongue is the ego. Theoden is the king who is unable to discharge his duties as king because he's bewitched by the magical whispering of this awful advisor. The ego is the magical, bewitching advisor. Admitting he may be somewhat at fault, he is sure that other people are more to blame. He becomes angry, indignant, self-pitying. And then later on, page 64, resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. I cannot start to solve the problem if I do not know what the problem is. The ego will have me point anywhere for the problem, but it. As soon as I drop the resentment, I look round, the only available culprit left for why things are the way they are is the ego. And that's when it's going to start shifting very uncomfortably in its seat. This is why resentment is, from it stem all forms of spiritual disease, is because it is the thing which permits spiritual disease to spread unchecked and never be remedied. Because resentment points my attention away from the real cause, which is the ego. The central delusion of self. So this is from page 61. What is his basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest happiness and satisfaction out of this world if he only manages well? Note the word victim, note the word delusion. The belief that my happiness depends on anything outside my consciousness. It's a delusion, it is untrue, but the person who is deluded is unaware that it is a delusion. It's the constant whispering of the ego, reinforced by the world. It doesn't come from the world, but it's reinforced. As if everyone is sharing the same delusion, there's no one there to wake anyone else up except we have recovery. All through history, there have been people trying to wake people up and failing. Isaiah trying to wake people up and failing. So, self is the universal ego, and it's so interesting in the book. Pages 60 to 62 are not about alcoholics, they're about people. And the example of the self-centered actor, it gives the alcoholic as the last one. Before that, we have the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in the winter, complaining of the sad state of the nation. The minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century. The list goes on. Alcoholics are just one example of those. And also, we realise that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Again, this is universal. It's not just us. It's not just alcoholics and addicts. Now, when one is running amok, when I'm running amok in my life, I feel like I'm in charge. People say this phrase, I, so it starts with the wrong word, I, as though I'm in charge. I am taking back my will. I take an action. My will, I take it back. That's not what the book says. It's you shouldn't read the book because it just destroys all of the things you think are true. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. The victim of a delusion is not in charge. If I'm driven, I'm not driving. Someone or something else is the agent. What's that agent? The ego. And then, if you think that was a mistake, you get to page 66. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others had power to actually kill. When I'm full of resentment, when I'm full of fear, when I'm causing trouble, when I'm being beastly to people, when I'm interfering, I'm not in charge. The ego is in charge. I'm being driven. I've fallen off the horse. My foot is stuck in the stirrup. The horse is galloping away and I'm bumping along behind saying, look how well I'm riding the horse. I'm not riding, I'm being dragged. The illusion of autonomy. The choice with the program is to go from being driven by the ego or led by God. Driven by the ego or led by God. Pick one. There are no other options. If you'll permit me to quote, I think it's chapter 7 of Romans, St. Paul says you can either be a slave to sin or a servant of God. Again, pick between them. There's a wonderful line in there. I do the things I don't want to do. I don't do the things that I want to do. In the Book of Common Prayer, there is no health in us. It's a brilliant line. So the problem here is the delusion that I'm in charge when I'm not. So to get out of this, I've got to go from blaming others to taking responsibility. And ironically, the taking responsibility is to recognize that, in a sense, I haven't been responsible for this. The ego has been responsible for this. But I am the one who is responsible for remaining allied to the ego. I'm the only one that can decide against that choice. So now that would be enough to turn to God, but we've got this extra motivation as addicts for turning to God. Page 62. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. In other words, if I don't get rid of the selfishness, if I remain trapped inside myself, I thought of it like this today. I was talking to someone. You get one resentment, a real stinker of a resentment. The rest of your life is fine. But that resentment turns that little part of your life grey. But the resentment cuts me off from God, and then everything turns grey. When that happens, then I'm no longer in contact with the only force that can definitely ensure my sobriety. So even if I had no other good reason, I hope I've covered some good reasons for turning one's will and life over to God. The cold hard truth at the bottom of it is if I don't, I'm going to drink again sooner or later. Now the great promise is that if we get this decision right, if we decide to start walking in a new direction, that sorts out the spiritual malady, and then everything else flows from that. I'm just putting the quotation in there, page 64. Now, here's one of the problems. Self will not abolish self. The cockroaches are not going to call the exterminator, and when the exterminator comes, the cockroaches are not going to cooperate in the operation. What it says is, let me have a look. There often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. So this is not something, just like with Fred and the alcoholism, he thought that he could, with the information about the mental obsession, simply avoid a drink. Information is not enough here. One needs power from God to break the ego. And the next few passages, I think, elaborate on how I do that. The way I do that is to admit failure, to admit, as someone in my 30s, I said to someone, they said to me, "Are you happy?" And I said, "Well, I'm reasonably happy, and lots of things are going well. There are a couple of areas which aren't." And he said, "Let's see if we can get this to a yes/no answer. Are you happy? Yes or no?" And eventually I said no. And he said, "When did you think your plan was going to kick in?" The system is never going to work. The system of self is never going to work. Why? Because I've been playing God. Instead of playing the role God would have me play, I've been playing God. God is the deviser of plans, and I'd been devising plans. God is the orchestrator. There's a Swedish proverb. Let's see if I can get it right. Människan spår men Gud rår. Man predicts, but God is in charge. Very simple idea on page 52. Our ideas did not work. What's exhibit A? My life as it was in my 30s. Lots of things were okay, but the things that weren't were not getting any better despite everything I had thrown at them. Some things yield to self-will. This is why it's tricky. So you think, well, self-will has worked with getting a career. Self-will, I've learnt how to behave in a sociable manner. And so I had friends. I'd learnt lots of things, really without much God. But there are certain things I couldn't get past. I couldn't get past my family. I couldn't get past some philosophical questions. There were things which were eating my lunch spiritually, psychologically, emotionally. I had to recognize that my system didn't work. Also, great line on 64, if the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. And the principle here is you get rid of what doesn't work for the thing that does. It talks on 52, the readiness with which we throw away the gadget which does not work for something new which does. And as I said earlier, I won't read the quotation from page 42, spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I can't think of anything today where getting my relationship with God right in relation to the problem hasn't been the start of solving it. Even if you have to call a plumber, I have to get the problem is not the thing out there. The problem is the sense that there is a problem. I can't get rid of problems myself. I create problems myself. As I've covered in other weeks, the solution is not a patch, but an upgrade. It's very interesting. I love what Fred says on page 42. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and I hope more useful than the life I lived before. And this is where it gets fascinating. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one. So it's not that the world is wicked and people are wicked, but no, it's fine. But it's not going to satisfy. And there's a subtlety to that. He would not go back if he could. And I wouldn't go back. If I could unaddict myself, I would not abandon the program. I'd stick with the program in exactly the way I'm using it now. And there are some wonderful quotations which absolutely reflect my experience. Spiritually minded persons of all races, colours and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness and usefulness which we should have sought ourselves, and in the face of collapse and despair, in the face of the total failure of their human resources, they found, these are the great words, a new power, peace, happiness and sense of direction flowed into them. So there is hope. So it's been a lot about problems today, but step 3 needs a bit of preparation. Next week it's going to be step 3 and steps 10 and 11, maybe just step 11. We'll see. see how much we get done. But next week is going to be about the relationship with God. So Keith, back to you to open things up for a moment. Okay, and the chat function is probably the best place to pose the questions rather than raising hands, because I'm doing a backup recording on the device which won't pick up your voices, only picks up mine. What's the line, someone's asked, between Al-Anon step 1 and step 3? I'm going to answer that as I've understood it. If you can elaborate in the chat whilst I'm starting to talk about that, that would help. So I will cover this from an Al-Anon point of view, how you get to step 1. Okay, step 1 in Al-Anon. Let's cover that. When I take people through the program in Al-Anon, because I'm a member of Al-Anon as well, first of all, we look at the alcoholic from the outside. So we recognise that the alcoholic, the addict, is powerless after the first drink, powerless over the first drink, and nothing they do can stop that. Providence will stop them in their tracks. When Providence stops them in their tracks, recovery is possible. And you, little missy, can't stop them either, as I can't. I've not been able to stop my alcoholics. If they can't stop themselves, why would I be able to stop them? So to understand why I can't stop them, I have to understand why they can't stop them. Then it all makes sense. But then I discover something absolutely horrific in step 1 in Al-Anon. Apart from all of the behaviours, the insanity of trying to get someone to stop, or get people to get well, or just get people to behave themselves. That does two things. It causes all sorts of problems in relationships, and of course it doesn't work, but it distracts me from all the things that I'm supposed to be doing. So my life goes to rack and ruin while I'm running around trying to sort everyone else out. I mean, I've dashed across London picking up prescriptions for drug addicts. What should I have been doing? I don't know. Something else, not that. But the worst thing is this. When I had active alcoholics, active addicts in my life, and you know what, even in recovery it's been the case as well with sort of sponsees, but far less. But when I've had people that I've been very, very close to who are in active addiction, they have sprees. So the doctor's opinion talks about the well-known stages of a spree. And a spree, one of the stages is the collapse of the spree. The person wakes up remorseful with resolve never to do it again, and there is a period of sobriety and recovery. And during that, there's a gradual building up to the next relapse. And that cycle goes round and round and round. Now, what I do as an Al-Anon, they get all the fun of the fair, all of the excitement of being on that roller coaster. I get in the roller coaster with them. I enjoy the ride in exactly the same way that they're enjoying it. So they are drinking on my behalf. They are drinking for me. I'm drinking by proxy through them. And I go through all of those stages. And I've had people in the early stages of Al-Anon, sponsees, and the husband didn't come back the night before, and they call the next morning and they're in a terrible state. They sound like they've got a hangover, voice all creaky. And that's when it struck me, the Al-Anon is doing the same as the alcoholic, going through all of the stages of the spree, just without the alcohol. And the Al-Anon, I had to want to stop that. I had to want peace more than I wanted that drama. I only felt alive if I had an active alcoholic in my life. When everyone was well, I started to get very twitchy, looking around for one. And in some cases, you'll see how an Al-Anon, I've done this, I think. An Al-Anon will drive the alcoholic to drink so the Al-Anon can get on the roller coaster. It's just as deadly, just as strange. But between step 1 and step 3 is exactly the same. It's recognition of failure, recognition that God is necessary to get in there between the impulse to drink or the impulse to interfere, the impulse to get into the cage with the alcoholic dancing with the gorilla. I need God to stop me getting in there. And I need God to help sort out all of those other things. So we've got some other questions. The book referring to Wormtongue is The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers is the book which covers that, all the stuff in Rohan. To tell a newcomer that only God can help, is this a very difficult answer to say to them? But it's the truth. What's the best way to approach this situation? Louise, who is a friend of mine, I didn't know her very well, but I met her a few times and we got on like a house on fire. She was a French Canadian who lived in Texas, if you can imagine that combination. And she was 40 years in AA and Al-Anon when I knew her. And she said, you might as well tell them the truth because they're going to die anyway. You learn about them. So it covers it well in chapter 7. You find a way of putting it which is going to work. You can simply, you really start by saying, for people who are atheists, God is the code word for a power operating in people's lives. You look at the fact that any human being has examples of where they got information and power from outside of themselves that they couldn't muster themselves, and they were able to achieve things with encouragement and support and tips and help. That's a power greater than yourself. Now, what the ultimate origin is of that, you can leave that till later. But I think it was Mark Houston who said, in response to people that said that God will scare people out of AA, he said, well, alcohol will scare them back. And I think that's pretty true as well. And I had nowhere else to go, so I just had to put up with the fact it was about God. It's not hard when you know you're going to die. Let's see what else we've got. Where is the line between giving guidance in the book and pointing out facts to an unwilling addict and stepping back in order to encourage them to have their own experience? Well, there's lots in there. You see, the answer is in the question there. If they're not willing, not interested, when I'm sponsoring people, if there's any hint of a lack of enthusiasm, I say, let's just stop, let's just pause for a minute. When you're excited about this, come back and we'll carry on the conversation. I don't try and pick unripe apples. And that's just the end of it. If, like the line on page 58, if you've decided and a decision, you don't turn back on a decision. If you've decided you want, that's emotional. What we have, a relationship with God, and are willing to go to any lengths, then you're ready to take certain steps. So in a 12-step call, if they're listening, I'll explain it. If they start arguing, I say, well, maybe let's pick this up another time, but I'm not here to argue. The book talks about offering and explaining. Attraction, not promotion, in tradition 11. I set out the stall, but if you start arguing with the shopkeeper, I went into a Christian bookshop in 1994 in Battersea, and I was bloody minded, and I thought, I'm going to start an argument with the woman behind the counter. And as soon as she got wind, as soon as she worked out what my game was, it didn't take her long. She said, this conversation is not to the grace of God. We are closed. So that's my approach. You do it nicely, but that's basically it. If there's argument, it's over. They've already made up their mind. Maureen said, if they want it, want emotional. If they want it, you can't say anything wrong. If they don't, you can't say anything right. Are there elements of my driven will or ego that are God-given or God's will? The design of the system appears to be that I have a will and I have the ability to choose between good and evil. Therefore, the existence of evil apparently is part of the plan. Without it, well, there wouldn't be much of a choice. Life would be simply like one of those ice cream parlours in America with 47 flavours and a quarter of the price of ice creams in London. Whatever you choose, you're going to have an absolutely splendid time. You don't have free will in an ice cream parlour because everything is fine. Free will is only if you're really choosing between radically different options. There's a useful idea in some religions where they talk about the distinction between God's perfect will and God's permissive will. God's perfect will is what God definitely wants. So the opening of crocuses in spring and me sending my cousins Christmas cards, I think these come under the heading of God's perfect will. Anything else is God's permitted will. God doesn't like it, but it is the price of a system which allows, number one, for matter and mortality, number two, for free will. So in C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain, which I referred to last week, those are the two big reasons for so-called evil in the world. The existence of matter and the existence of will. And those two domains are going to give rise to things which in the short and medium term are awful, but the bigger picture is fine, is the idea. How does the idea of the actor work? Is it still useful as a servant of God? Is the problem the attachment to one's acting? So I think it's a tremendously helpful image. It's an image which keeps on giving, keeps on helping as we go through recovery. So if the material world is the play going on the stage, the material world is not unreal. It really is there. There are some spiritual paths which try to deny that it is there, and it can lead to a real callousness about other people's suffering. There is something real going on, but there is a greater reality, which is the world of the spirit. The book talks about having our head in the clouds with God, our feet on the earth. So as the actor, I go through the world playing the roles, plural, that God assigns. And if God is the director, the playwright, and the producer, God provides as the producer everything I need. As the playwright and the director, he gives me the role, the character I'm supposed to play. He gives me the lines. So I think it's very helpful. The problem, I think being attached to being an actor would be wonderful. The problem is not the attachment to being the actor. If only we could remember we were actors subservient to this whole system of the theatre, we would be fine. It's the actor who is attached to the idea of being the director. The actor who forgets he's an actor and becomes the part that he is playing. That's the illusion that must be smashed. Is it possible to study the Big Book and 12 Steps with online meetings without attending AA groups face to face and keep being sober? I've known people who've done it and done it with tremendous success. In one case, it was with an awful lot of help with from Buddhists. He lived in a Buddhist country and acquired Buddhism, a particular form of Buddhism, as his religion. And I think by his own reckoning, he couldn't have done it without that. There are people I've met who live in the outback of Australia, where they're a 4-hour drive to the nearest town, and the nearest town has 12 people living in it. There are no AA meetings. And I remember one of them visited London, and he said he would come to Sydney once a year for 3 or 4 weeks just to get lots of business transacted before he went to live in the outback again. He said he went to meetings because it was helpful to meet alcoholics and addicts, to find people to carry the message to. This is before the internet was very big with online meetings. He said he didn't much enjoy the meetings because people didn't talk about the programme, and when they did, it seemed to bear no relation to the programme in either the 12 and 12 of the Big Book, so it was a bit difficult for him. People do it, but honestly, it's really hard. I tried it in Russia, where there was almost no AA, and I needed the people around me physically. So it is possible, but good luck. Try and find a way to do this with people. What are some normal, maybe healthy signs of the ego being deflated? When my ego is deflated, I'm more likely to sing or whistle spontaneously. I'm not thinking about myself. Time goes very quickly. When people ask me to do things, I'm thrilled. Things just don't seem to bother me. The phrase, I think, is buzzing along. I'm just buzzing along. And I think that was the last question, if I'm not mistaken. So, Keith, I think we're done. Are we done? We're done. Very good.